Do
Well,
you
good
edit?
afternoon if you are on the East Coast of the United States. Good evening if you are in Parma, Italy. Good overnight if you are in Asia, in Australia, New Zealand. Hello in Africa and South America, and listeners all across North America. This is Fred Plotkin on Fridays. That makes me Fred Plotkin. Welcome. This is IDAGIO, the place where classical music happens. As you know, IDAGIO is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. As regular listeners know, I tend to invite people who inspire me with their work, with who they are, what they do. And in some cases, they're people I know personally. In the case of today's guest, I have never met her, I've never conversed with her, but I came across a book that she is one of the authors of, and I so loved it that I wanted to ask Lucy Antek Johnson to join me. Welcome, Lucy.
Well, thank you, Fred. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
I'm going to show the book right away. This Was Toscanini. It came out in August of 2021, but it's based on an earlier book, This Was Toscanini, that came out in 1963, and that's what we're going to talk about. The authors are Samuel Antek, your father, and Lucy Antek Johnson. Your father died quite a long time ago, 1959, 58?
58.
And this book came out in 63 through the efforts of your mother, primarily, who was able to compile it. And in reading this book, and it's really wonderful, I began to think in terms of a telescope. And the reason for that is that we go back in time to the time of Arturo Toscanini, who is the original subject of the book. But with our telescope, the other subject of the book is your father. And not just the relationship that your father had with Toscanini, which was significant, quite significant, as we will explore, but his relationship with you, his relationship with your mother, his relationship with music, his relationship with the violin, and his being a man of his time. And the book, I'm a native New Yorker, you are too. I think you're an Upper West Sider by birth.
Yes, I am.
Evokes our neighborhood. It evokes
Right.
Carnegie Hall, and it evokes Rockefeller Center, and places that are iconic all around the world, but in a particular way to New Yorkers, because we walk past them, we have inhabited them, we've worked in them, and therefore it's a very personal book. The book also has magnificent photographs from the era by Robert Hupka. Am I pronouncing his name correctly?
Correct. Absolutely.
And it's a story, one of the stories of your father's being a first violinist in the NBC Symphony Orchestra. It was a radio orchestra, but then it performed live in Carnegie Hall. And it was founded in 1937 by David Sarnoff, who was then the head of RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, which merged kind of with NBC National. It's not Nabisco. People think it's the company that makes Oreo cookies, NBC, but no, it's the National Broadcasting Company. And this was a phenomenon of its time that I'm afraid we will never see in America again, where an orchestra is created by a radio network and brought music to the masses. I in reading your book and then doing my own research, I read up about David Sarnoff, who came from about two shtetls over from where my grandmother was from, back in Belarus. And also in that same area was the artist Marc Chagall.
Right.
And these people came to America with nothing. And David Sarnoff came to know Einstein. He became expert in the radio and technology and television too, and saw these media not as things just to divert and bore the masses, but to enrich the masses and to bring them opera, classical music, theater in their homes, first on radio and then on television. So your father was in at the very beginning, 1937. How did he meet Toscanini? How was he hired? And was he hired by Toscanini or by Pierre Monteux or David Sarnoff?
Well, he was, Dad was already a virtuoso violinist. He had started to gain his own reputation. He had just appeared at town hall. He was concertizing, and he was handpicked, as were all the original players. I'm pretty sure Toscanini, who was kept apprised of all these people, was not in on the sessions of, shall we pick this person or that person. I believe it was Shatsanov, who one of the trusted friends of Toscanini and an emissary and a liaison between Sarnoff and Toscanini. He really helped put this all together. And so by the time it was formed, you had some of the top players from all around the world who had been soloists on their own, or whatever their hopes and dreams were. They were young people, and it was all men in those days, different era. And they were all relatively young men, and a lot of Jewish refugees. And so they came from their different disciplines, and Dad was in New York, having grown up in Chicago, but he had gone to Juilliard, had studied with Leopold Auer, and was just at that brink of really breaking out as a soloist when this opportunity came along. And Toscanini, as you've said, was at the pinnacle of his fame. He was a rock star. He was sometimes considered the most famous man in the world. And in its day and in that period, it was deserved. He filled arenas around the world. He was a humanitarian, which I'd love to talk about at some point.
So would
and he was 70 years old when this orchestra was formed. So for Sarnoff and for RCA, who were they owned the NBC radio network. Mm-hmm. It was the jewel in the crown for them, for their radio schedule and for their recording division. So Sarnoff could be called an entrepreneur or an impresario, if you will, but he was also a businessman, and he saw the value of starting this orchestra, and it turned out to be a true jewel in the crown for 17 years.
So this was still the economic depression, 1937. And this orchestra, when constituted, became the best paid orchestra in America immediately, so that Sarnoff and company gathered the greatest talent they could find because they had the money to attract that kind of talent. And it was the first orchestra in America to have a 52-week contract. We don't always know that musicians, when they're not playing, sometimes they have to collect unemployment insurance or find other work because their orchestras don't have full contracts. Now there are others that do. But
also by having a 52-week-a-year contract, they had to agree to play in the house orchestra for the NBC radio programs, for other programs.
I see.
So they did work outside of those particular live broadcasts.
But it was steady work for musicians who always need steady work if they can find it, even the great ones. And therefore, it was a model in many, many ways. What I'd like to do now, with your consent, is I'd like to read from the book. But let me explain something first. Your father wrote beautiful stuff that was published about Toscanini in your father's lifetime, some of which was published. Other works that he wrote became part of this collection of the book. But then you have written, I would call them introductory chapters to his writing. And they're wonderful too, because number one, you write very well and very lovingly, but number two, we are in 2021, we are in 1948 or 1954 or whatever, and 1957. And simultaneously, we're forming this thread going back through history. So what I am going to read with your permission is something your father wrote. It was, I think, the first section that he wrote about playing with Toscanini. In the fall of 1937, a great symphony orchestra brought together from the far corners of the world sat in rapt and tingling silence on the huge stage of Studio 8H in Radio City, New York. I was a violinist in that orchestra, and we were awaiting the first appearance of our conductor. There was no audience. The men, instruments in hand, sat nervously rigid, scarcely breathing. Suddenly, from a door on the right side of the stage, a small, solidly built man emerged. Immediately discernible were the crowning white hair and the impassive, square, high cheekboned, be-mustache faced. He was dressed in a severely cut black alpaca jacket with a high clerical collar, formal striped trousers, and pointed slipper-like shoes. In his hand, he carried a baton. In awed stillness, we watched covertly as he walked up the few steps leading to the stage. As he stepped up to the podium, we all rose like puppets, suddenly propelled to life by the pent-up tension. We had been warned in advance not to make any vocal demonstration, and we stood silent, eagerly and anxiously staring. He looked around, apparently bewildered by our unexpected action, and gestured a faint greeting with both arms, a mechanical smile lighting his pale face for an instant. Somewhat embarrassed, we sat down again. Then, in a rough, hoarse voice, he called out, "Brahms!" He looked at us piercingly for the briefest moment, then raised his arms. In one smashing stroke, the baton came down. A vibrant sound suddenly gushed forth from the tense players. Thus began my first rehearsal with Arturo Toscanini, his first with the newly formed NBC Symphony. He, who was to become our beloved old man, was then 70. With each heart-pounding timpani stroke in the opening bars of Brahms's first symphony, his baton beat became more powerful, more insistent. His shoulders strained and hunched as though buffeting against a giant wind. His outstretched left arm spasmodically flailed the air, the cupped fingers pleading like a beseeching beggar. His face reddened, muscles tightened, eyes and eyebrows constantly moving. As we in the violin section tore with our bows against our strings, I felt I was being sucked into a roaring maelstrom of sound. Every bit of strength and skill called upon and strained into being. Bits of breath, muscle, and blood never before used were being drained from me. I sensed more than I heard with near disbelief the new sounds around me. Was this the same music we had been practicing so assiduously for days? Like ships torn from their mooring in a stormy ocean, we bobbed and tossed, responding to these earnest, importuning gestures. With what a new fierce joy we played. So, he bellowed, cantare, sostenere. His legs were bending slightly as he braced himself for his violent movements, which were to become larger, more pile driving as the music reached its first great climax. Cantare, sostenere. I was to hear these words often in the years to come. Sing, sustain. This was Toscanini's battle cry. This was the first time they were flung at us, and for 17 years we lived by them. Toscanini often said, any asino can conduct, but to make music, is difficile. Playing with Toscanini was a musical rebirth. The clarity, intensity, and honesty of his musical vision, his own torment, was like a cleansing baptismal pool. Caught up in his force, your own indifference was washed away. You were not just a player, another musician, but an artist, once more searching for long forgotten ideals and truths. You were curiously alive and there was a purpose and self-fulfillment to your work. It was not a job, it was a calling. Like every great leader, Toscanini never demanded anything of his orchestra beyond what he himself had already given in full measure. Look at me, I give everything, everything, he would scream hoarsely, beating his chest with his clenched fist. Look at me, vergogna, shame on you, you. Toscanini not only lived music, he, more than any musician I've ever known, made music seem like life itself. In his struggle for the ultimate truth, Toscanini never gave up. He was always St. George fighting the dragon that was guarding the musical treasure. And to me, it was tremendously exciting and a privilege to be caught up in this great battle with him. So Lucy, that's gorgeous writing.
Bravo to you. That's great reading too.
Thank you. But that I've written a lot about music. I read writing about music all the time as I live and breathe. But that writing communicated so much about the man, the time, the environment, the everything that your father and then you would set out in the future in the book. And it's from near the beginning of the book, and I read it because it lays down so many themes right away. And by the way, for listeners who don't know, asino means ass or donkey. What of the ideas that I just read from particularly strikes you and that you want to talk about more?
Well, his passion is kind of a running theme throughout all of my father's writing, and his total dedication to music and to making beautiful music. I mean, that sometimes he would get frustrated. Most of the times the frustration was at his own standards that he had set for himself. Sometimes, obviously, something went wrong in the orchestra, but it was all in service of the music. And the men, the players throughout, not just the original ones, even though it was very tough sometimes to be in some of those grueling rehearsals where he was not just a tough taskmaster, but where it reached certain emotional peaks, they loved him. And they loved him for his passion, and they loved him because his passion and his dedication to striving, as it says in that piece, for the ultimate truth, made each of them feel that they were better musicians on their own. And that's, to me, a theme throughout the whole story. My father definitely, I mean, it's, in a sense, they're all love stories here, you know, love of music, and my love for my father and my father's love for his experience. But even if it's a chapter about the touring or a chapter about a visit to his home, to Toscanini's home in Riverdale, it's about the music, and it was in service of the music. And so that's, to me, why this opening few pages always was the most powerful to me, because everything you said, it set the stage for time, place, personality, and goal, and you know, hopes and dreams. They had rehearsed the orchestra with other conductors prior to this first rehearsal in preparation for the master who was coming. And it was Pierre Monteux and Arturo. Fine, extraordinary conductors. But as you hear from my father saying, all of a sudden when that downbeat happened and they dove into that music that they had been playing for weeks, it was a whole different experience. So it was a very, from what I read, symbiotic, the players. You know, my dad talks about how, yes, the audience mattered a great deal, whether they were in the concert hall or at home listening to a recording or a broadcast, but what the audience heard was a different experience than what the players experienced looking at him, and the relationship between the leader and the players had its own vibration that the audience could not possibly experience. They had another experience. So that's what
Would you
comes
talk
across.
more about what that experience is, what the players had? Would you talk more about the experience the players had?
Well, there was the grueling part of it where they're playing over and over and over the same phrases over and over and over, or sometimes it was at two grace notes that, you know, of a Wagner piece that just were not working, And it was exhausting and tiring. But, and not just in the rehearsals for the concerts, but in the recording sessions. That's a whole other subject of the recording sessions in those days and how challenging they were because of the technology. But each player felt that they, like he says at the end, it was not a job, it was a calling. They were all reaching for the same truths, and they were exposed to a truth that maybe they hadn't been exposed to before. And it carried through, and they could see his face. The audience didn't always get to see his face.
True.
That was a big
I'm
difference.
holding up the book again. I'm gonna do it a few times because I really want our viewers to see this book. It has gorgeous, I'm going to call them action photographs of Arturo Toscanini. The book is This Was Toscanini. And my guest is Lucy Antek Johnson, who wrote this book in a way with her father, Samuel Antek Johnson. You know, it's a bit like when Natalie Cole recorded Unforgettable
The duet.
to her father's. I didn't think of this until just this moment. Where Nat King Cole in the 50s recorded it. And it didn't with Natalie Cole, and it certainly doesn't with you, feel like taking advantage, but it's a deepening of an emotional experience that the reader has already, in that we have two fascinating figures and how they interlocked and connected and influence one another. And then, frankly, there's yourself, a fascinating figure who I came to appreciate in this book for your sensitivity to this world that I'll say predated you, because unfortunately you were only 12 when your father died. And therefore, so much of this was a rediscovery of things that you may, as a little girl, not have understood as you did as an adult woman. Am I on the right track?
Totally. You know, I sometimes refer to this as a memoir wrapped within a memoir, because what my father wrote is, to me, the star, the main attraction, and Toscanini being the star of the main attraction. And even though my father's book is written in the first person, he doesn't reveal very much about himself throughout. It's always in the service of what they were experiencing. So when I realized that I really wanted to, I was determined to reissue that, and I can tell you that backstory. I said, what can I contribute here? Oh, I'll write a little introduction. That's what Well, it turned out that I really, really wanted to give my father a little more center stage, because he hadn't talked about himself. And he had an illustrious career too, not just as a violinist, but he went on to become quite a prominent conductor in his own right, all with the support of the maestro. And he had both these careers happening simultaneously. Mm-hmm. And so I started to see there was an arc I could create of chapter introductions that would introduce me, it's my first person, introduce my dad more and his rise and the arc of his career, but also lead the reader each time into the chapter directly. So it's more of maybe a contemporary point of view. So I wove all those. It was an interesting challenge to weave those three ingredients into each introduction, because it's not about me, it includes me. And I share things about myself, but I knew from the get-go, this is not going to be about me. It's about him, and it's about the maestro, most importantly. And to bring that era Okay, you
So
froze
we
for a
had a bit
second.
of a freeze. You say bring that era was the last thing I heard.
Let's see well, it was reflections of that. You didn't miss anything. Because I saw that you had frozen. I have very good Wi-Fi, yet it said it was unstable, so I don't know.
Your mother, who to herself sounds like a fascinating figure, you wrote very beautifully about the fact that due to your father's sudden death from a heart attack on West 57th Street,
Yes.
near Carnegie Hall, it seems
Yeah.
he's not the only musician to whom that's happened, actually.
He was meeting his manager for
Yeah.
lunch at what was then the Great Northern Hotel.
Sure.
Yeah.
And your mother overnight went from being an orchestra wife, and I want to talk about that term more in a bit, to a widow with a 12-year-old child, and whose world in the 1950s was wrapped up in her husband's work and everything that extended from that, and also her daughter. What changed for her, and how did she address the changes as a woman that emerging in the 1960s where things were different?
Well, first of all, 3 became 2. It was now just mom and me. And 12 years old is a tough age for the 12-year-old and for the mother too.
Yes.
So not only was she alone now trying to deal with all this, but I was just at the start of being slightly rebellious, if you will. So it was a very, very difficult time financially and emotionally. And we enjoyed each other's company, but I was still 12 years old. And she was in shock for a long time. And even though the accolades came in and different awards were set up in his name and different scholarships, and that's all wonderful. And the letters poured in. But in the end, you're alone in the house. And it's not that she had fed off his career. She was truly a partner in a lot of his career. She was an artist in her own right and had her own identity. But she was devoted to being his partner and to supporting him. And especially when he was writing these essays, it took a few years. She would type them up and edit them. And, so she was very involved. And so a couple of years passed before she could even consider, how do I get back into this? And the publisher, Evelyn Schrift of Vanguard Press at the time, certainly gave her that time. She had become a family friend. She said to my mother, do you want to write the final chapter? Because my father hadn't really completed the book. The chapters are complete, but it cries out for an ending that isn't there. And we'll never know if it was supposed to be a lengthy essay or a short wrap-up. We'll never know, because he didn't leave any documentation specifically. And my mom
like Puccini's Turandot or Schubert's Unfinished Symphony, or the Mozart Requiem. Yeah,
that's why at the end of this book, just as the publisher had done it, it says, "Here ends the manuscript." She said, "No, I'm not going to write anything. Use his words. Just use his words." So that's what the original book was. And she was introduced to Robert Hupka, who had been a radio engineer for RCA and had been involved in years and years of the rehearsals, and had for those years taken hundreds and hundreds of candid photographs of the maestro in action, as you say, long lens. I mean, there were always people milling around, but the maestro was not aware that these particular pictures were being taken. And they have turned into being the most iconic pictures ever. They're so beautiful, but they're also iconic of his expressive way of working. And so the elegance, it was an elegant marriage to put out a book featuring his photographs and the text. And the photographs were used as quite often as illustrative moments for the text that was being read. And so that's how that came to that. And they worked together. Mom and Hopka worked together for 2 or 3 years at the dining room table with a layout of photographs and text. And he would blow up something. He was a photographer, even though he was a radio engineer, he was genuinely quite a special photographer. And that's how the book was published then. When I planned to republish, because I knew I wanted to add more material about my father, I chose very deliberately not to put as many Toscanini photographs in, but just enough to, again, illustrate a part of the text, because I was going to add some of my own photographs from my own archives, because I talk about my family and my father's career and the beginning of that, and I wanted to illustrate that. So it became a very creative melange. But the last chapter, which is something I'd like to talk about, which wasn't officially written, when I did the research, and I spent many, many hours at the New York Library at Lincoln Center, because I had donated all of his papers from that era to the library years before. So I went
just
back.
want to specify for listeners who are not from New York, we have a wonderful library called the New York Performing Arts Library at Lincoln Center, which is part of the New York Public Library System. It's one of the greatest such places in the world. And with so many people in New York who have worked in the arts, performing arts, the treasures there are phenomenal, and one could spend lifetimes doing research in there. And in your case, your father's papers, as you said, were there, so you got to go back and see the papers that you had donated.
And not that I hadn't seen them before, of course I had. However, 10 years later, with a different mission in mind, I sat over about a year and a half, 2 or 3 different times, because you had to order ahead. You had to order these boxes, and 10 boxes would show up, and you went into a private area. You could take photographs, but you couldn't take anything out. And I found the letters, and I found recordings, and I found programs, and I found his handwritten manuscript, first draft manuscript. And in those handwritten notes was a page called The Final Concert. And I thought, oh, how interesting. I will assume that he was keeping notes for what his last chapter might have been. We'll never know. Mm-hmm. But he writes about what turned out to be a rather sad experience. The final concert in April 1954, which was always going to be the final concert of the NBC season and probably of the NBC series. The Maestro was 87 at this point. And, but what happened, do you want me to tell the story of what happened at that concert?
Please, yeah.
They had a full program. It was a live broadcast. And in the middle of, I think it was Wagner's Tannhäuser Overture, the Maestro stops, just stops, drops the baton. And what do? It's a live broadcast. The audience at home is completely confused, especially when the engineers put on a whole other concert because they panic. The audience in the concert hall was baffled and, whispering. The orchestra didn't know what to do. I mean, this was a stunning moment. But however, within a few moments, maybe minutes, I'm not sure, he rallied and he kind of came back and he completed the concert. A little shaky. And my father has written, of which I quote in the book, I quote my father's notes about what it was like when Toscanini walked off the stage, dazed and confused, and he dropped the baton, and he was just drenched and spent. And he never, I don't believe he ever conducted again publicly.
No.
So we'll never know if that would have been the last chapter, but it's how I choose to end it, because it also kind of wraps up both my work and research and my dad's. writing.
And that part I'm not telling simply because I want people to get the book and read it. So it's beautiful. I was beautiful and sad, but it's better read, I think. That's why I read from the beginning of the book, not from the end of the book.
Yeah.
I do want to point out for listeners that the NBC Symphony Orchestra, after Toscanini stopped in 1954, it did not stop. It came to be known as the Symphony of the Air, and it had various conductors, especially Leopold Stokowski, and lasted until 1963. And to repeat also, it began in Studio 8H in Rockefeller Center, which everyone in America knows since 1975 has been where Saturday Night Live has been performed. So it's known as the historic Studio 8H. But at a certain point around the late 1940s to 1950, the orchestra actually performed in Carnegie Hall, as opposed to Studio 8H. Studio 8H became something for television production. People forget that distinction. So many of the famous performances, including that one you just spoke of, were from Carnegie Hall, which thankfully is still on West 57th Street. We almost lost it in 1960, but it's there.
Yeah. Part of the reason they moved, by the way, was the acoustics.
Yes, at Carnegie Hall, or better.
Yeah.
I want to, well, actually, there's something I alluded to I'd like to talk about more. The stories, the chapters in the book include playing with Toscanini, touring with Toscanini, recording with Toscanini, a visit with Toscanini. Toscanini conducts Oberon. In the touring with Toscanini chapter, where it involves a trip to South America during World War II, your mother, you say, was one of 10 orchestra wives. I wonder, well, in quote, but I wondered, Lucy, if you know that there was actually a movie at that time called Orchestra Wives.
No.
You're talking to a big cinephile. It was made in 1942. It's called Orchestra Wives. It starred Anne Rutherford, George Montgomery, and Glenn Miller, a world famous jazz and big band conductor, and a very young Jackie Gleason as the man most loyal to his wife, because some of the men in the orchestra were not necessarily so loyal. And Orchestra Wives was a euphemism in some ways for some women who travel with the orchestra, but who were not married to these men who were the players.
Gosh, much more complex than I knew.
Right. So the film is also a narrative about the relationships among the women, ranging from the very secured her marriage woman who married Jackie Gleason to the impressionable Anne Rutherford who marries George Montgomery after one night together. And the whole phenomenon of what we still in music call touring, even now with the pandemic on, which one day we hope will get back to normal or some new kind of normal, but touring was a very stressful thing for musicians because, number one, their instruments had to be transported. And if you have a violin or a flute, you're okay. But if you have a double bass, if you have tubas, if you have bigger instruments, harps, those have to be transported. There are tour managers. I've been a tour manager, and you have to be methodically, maniacally organized. Everyone is worried about everything. You have to worry about flights, hotel rooms, meals, nowadays about people's allergies to this or that food. And it's a very complicated thing. And at that time, there were organizations that actually ran the touring management. And when you had Toscanini going out, this was an even bigger event because there were the promotions. Everybody wanted a piece of the Maestro, and the Maestro wanted time to rehearse, and they sailed by ship then rather than flying, so they didn't quite deal with jet lag. But I want to point out that Toscanini's very first success, when he was about 17, 18, or 19, he was with an Italian orchestra in South America, in Rio de Janeiro, and the locally hired conductor just was not good for Aida, and a couple of other people were tried. And Toscanini, who played the cello, basically stepped up and said, well, I can do this. And he conducted Aida from memory at a very young age. And that was the launch of his career. Born March 25th, 1867. March 25th is the birthday of another patron saint of mine, Aretha Franklin, and 1942. And he died, Toscanini died January 16th of 1957. So he had a long life, almost 90 years. He knew Verdi. He knew Catalani, who's a composer we forget about, but he named his children, especially Vali, his daughter, after an opera by Catalani. He was a great champion of composers of his time. So Zandonai and Umberto Giordano and whoever was the rising composer, Toscanini would conduct all this new music, most famously Giacomo Puccini. Puccini's career got a huge boost by having Arturo Toscanini conducting some of the earlier works, such as Manon Lescaut and La Boheme. Tosca, no. Tosca was not the premiere by Toscanini, but Madama Butterfly and many, many more. And Puccini was a great advocate of technology. And Puccini was fascinated by radio recording and so on. And he really was the first great Italian musician to embrace that and brought along people like Toscanini and Enrico Caruso and other artists. So the fact that we have recordings from 1904, 1905 is really owing to Puccini's fascination and passion with technology. Puccini also had one of the first telephones in Italy. And the problem was no one else had a telephone in Italy. So he had no one to talk to. But one of the first telephones was actually at RCA in New York. And Puccini formed this relationship with RCA early on to start recording things. And so Puccini came to New York twice. First for the premiere at the Met of Madama Butterfly. It premiered in Italy first, but then at the Met. And he supervised that. And in 1907, they recorded Puccini's voice. And somewhere in my collection, I actually have that recording of Puccini's voice and his wife's voice greeting the American public. And then they have a broadcast of him broadcasting back to Italy. It was the first transatlantic broadcast.
Oh my goodness.
It was Puccini and his wife talking to the Italian public. Eccoci a New York, here we are in New York. And then Puccini, thanks to Toscanini, was commissioned to write Il Trittico, the three operas being Il Tabarro, The Cloak, Suor Angelica, and Gianni Schicchi, which premiered at the Met. I'm sorry, I left out something else. La Fanciulla del West came before that in 1910, and Toscanini conducted. So these are important figures in the creation of musical taste in New York City, because I work at New York Public Radio for WQXR, and New York Public Radio, WNYC, New York City, was created in 1924. It was called WNYC, and it was the mayor's station, so to speak. And the mayor at that time was Fiorello LaGuardia. And LaGuardia loved the music of Puccini. LaGuardia had been consul in, I'm forgetting the town now, Pola was called, which was part of Italy. Now it's part of either Croatia or Slovenia, I think Croatia. And Fiorello LaGuardia fell in love with the music of Puccini. So in the 1920s, when my parents were born and listening to radio, they heard all the time the music of Giacomo Puccini, because that was the mayor's preferred composer. The mayor admired Toscanini, and Toscanini in the 1920s went back to Italy, but then in 1931, after he was beaten up by fascists because he would not play the fascist hymn in the theater in Bologna, Toscanini spent much of the 1930s and 40s and early 50s in New York. And that led to Sarnoff thinking of creating the NBC Symphony, because Toscanini, great political progressive, liberal, utopian thinker, could not really function in Italy at that time because of the fascist rule of Mussolini. So that's a bit of the background context for how he was in New York and why we in New York City so profoundly feel his presence. He had a home in Wave Hill in the Bronx, and he had parties there, and
then it was Villa Pauline.
that was
after.
Villa Pauline, you're right. And you and I have a mutual friend named Harvey Sachs, who I would describe as the Toscanini authority, so much so that the Toscanini family consults Harvey about their grandfather and great-grandfather.
He wrote the foreword to this book.
That's what I wanted to mention too, that Harvey, in his writing, has written about your father's original writing and how that inspired him. So people who want to really learn about Toscanini after reading This Was Toscanini, I recommend looking at the writings of Harvey Sachs as well.
It was Harvey's more recent biography, Toscanini, a musician of conscience, where he quoted passages from my father's book that really kicked off my endeavor. 2017, it was this when that book came out, and then Harvey and I got together, and I said, "What do you think?" Because Harvey said he was also using the book for years in his classes that he would teach and lectures. And he said, "This would be fabulous. Of course, because it was out of print, and maybe on Amazon you could get a copy, but it was hit and miss." And that's really what kickstarted my journey, was Harvey's publication of Harvey's book. And then he's become a very good friend, and he was generous to write the foreword for this book.
Do you feel that we could have a Toscanini now, even if there was someone of his great genius coming along? Do we have the conditions now where that kind of person, man or woman, could be possible?
Well, I speak from a very narrow vantage point here, but I will use someone else as an example. In Westport, at the Westport Library last spring, we did a whole evening to honor Itzhak Perlman. And one of the questions to Mr. Perlman, who is my idol anyway, one of the questions to him was, could there be, just what you're saying, he wasn't so much a conductor, it was more of a soloist. He felt absolutely, he said, it's going to depend on their personality and how they break through. He didn't get specific, but the point when he felt very hopeful. So I will take his cue a little bit and say, even though the world of classical music has dispersed, it is not part of everyone's daily life the way it used to be. People don't go to, well, putting the pandemic, in general, it's not part of their life the way it used to be. And orchestras are suffering financially, and now even more so. But when there's a personality and someone who musically and through their magnetic, charismatic way of communicating their music, if possible, could break through. The question would be, where would they be able to apply their wares? I'm no expert on that, but talent is talent, and perseverance is perseverance. There's somebody, as we're talking, there are probably 10 people as we're talking, whether it's in Juilliard or Curtis or Eastman School, that is dying to be that person and feel that they're going to bring something new to the next generation. Hope they do. Hope they do. I don't know what the delivery system will be.
Well, that's part of it, is that my question involved not just, is there such a person? Because I agree with you. I think there is such a person. I don't know who that is, but I believe that with each generation, we have a tiny handful of people who are equipped to do extraordinary things to change the world. but I wonder whether classical music is the vehicle for that, because let's take someone like Steve Jobs, who founded Apple and innovated with Apple. He was there at a time when there was the appetite and interest for what he had to present. Whereas radio and then television, I would say that Leonard Bernstein was not the heir to Toscanini, but if they were running a marathon, Toscanini handed the baton to Bernstein, who then went in the direction of television, who became more involved with recording, as did Herbert von Karajan and other conductors, in a golden age of recording, when all the great recording companies would vie for the great conductors and singers and instrumentalists so that they would be able to record. Bernstein recorded whatever he wanted for Columbia Records.
Well, and he was also composing.
He was a composer and a great teacher.
Yeah.
Toscanini, I believe, had private students, but he was not the public teacher, the Pied Piper. Regular listeners know that I, at the age of 6, was one of Lenny's, as we called him, focus group of children on whom he tested out his ideas and his teaching methods and his vocabulary before doing his young people's concerts, of which he did 53 or 54 that are now part of recorded legacy in the Museum of Broadcasting, and I imagine some on YouTube. But Toscanini's outreach was certainly formidable, but it was different in that his job was being the maestro, was serving the music and finding that truth, and not necessarily putting it into words. Bernstein put it into words. Your father eloquently put into words in his book what this mercurial thing called music can be and how it's made and how it can be experienced. But what I loved in it is that he didn't dictate to the reader what the reader should experience, but just unlocked ideas about how to get toward the music.
And may I mention that when my father became a rising conductor in his own right, all the while keeping his violin seat warm at NBC, he became, among other things, musical director and conductor of the New Jersey Symphony. And in that 10-year period, he developed children's concerts a few years before Leonard Bernstein. And it was, they were very innovative, they were very interactive, and kids would come from all over the state, and standing room only, so to speak. And it was those concerts, the templates of those concerts, that he, Samuel Antek, was invited to Philadelphia, to Buffalo, to Houston, to do them, because it was a new concept to involve children. And my father then became the director of all children's concerts for Philadelphia Orchestra. All of this was happening, and then he died. So I like to think in the back of my mind, maybe that baton would have been passed to him a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't know. We'll never know.
Actually, when I said running the race and handing the baton, I really meant in the Olympic sense, not in the orchestral sense, but you're right on that as well.
But also I want to say the maestro was 70 years old when he started with NBC. Most people have retired at that point. He's a man of his era, you know, before 1900 to let's say the first 1937. He only knew the world that he knew. He wasn't thinking big thoughts about, television, what's the next step? He had already done his innovations, if you will. And it was Bernstein and the other conductors who knew how to take it into the next era of what was available technically, and to become more connected to the audience.
I worked for many years with James Levine, who died not too long ago. I forget, I should know this, was he 77 or 78, but I know he was born in June of 1943. And I had the great privilege once every 2 months of having an hour with him, because he knew that I was a good learner. that I had studied with Bernstein and that I'm a pretty good communicator, and that perhaps a lot of what he taught me about whatever the topic was, I would preserve and pass on. And sometimes he would say, what do you want to talk about? And other times he would say, I'm working on this particular piece, and that's what I'd like to talk to you about. And one time I said to him, when he was probably in his early 50s, maybe late 40s, what are the pieces that you're going to play later in life? And this is, we didn't know that he would have his disabilities and all the medical and physical challenges he had. He said, the great time for a conductor is the age of 70. And I mention that because you're talking about Toscanini. He said, because at 70, the conductor still has, he referred to his, I want to say hers as well, has his mind, enough energy, and a knowledge of the music and a relationship to the music that he can pick the things that mean the most to him and go deep with them. And I know that a lot of what Toscanini did, starting at the age of 70, was, yes, he introduced new works, and I want to talk about one of them after, but he also really went deep on the works he was closest to, Beethoven, Wagner, Verdi, and others, and brought them to a new audience in America and around the world, but also brought them to all of these musicians, your father among them, who then took what he imbued them with and went elsewhere with it. Sadly, James Levine didn't get to do that, and I regret that. And this is actually the first time I'm mentioning publicly what he said to me about looking forward to his 70s and what he would do in his 70s. He never, unfortunately, he did a few things, Falstaff, Così fan tutte, but he died of cancer in, I believe, March of 2021. And he was supposed to have conducted in Florence, and he was going to do Brahms, Berlioz, and Mozart. And we had been in touch because I wanted to ask him about those three works, and I was going to have him on this program, but then the cancer appeared, and that was it. But I always think about what he said to me, because he was a man who chose his words very carefully. This concept of the age of 70 being a golden time for a great conductor. So when I read about Toscanini starting this new project with the NBC Symphony at the age of 70, I see that not as the conclusion. I see that as the distillation of the essence of everything that he had learned and understood and experienced in his life up to that point. And
I would absolutely believe that he thought he had something he could really bring to this new experience and embellish on it. Creatively, he was still cooking, you know.
Yeah. Well, so one of the works that he is very famous for, and I admire him for, actually, before we get to that work, would you talk about him from your perspective? I mean, Toscanini and your dad, if you want, in this context, politics, world issues. There was fascism, there was communism in parts of the world, there was Nazism, there was all that going on.
Yeah, as popular as he was around the world, and he made headlines wherever he went, he made headlines for his politics as well, because he was a staunch anti-fascist. And he had already in the 30s stood up to Hitler and refused to play in Germany, and then ultimately in other countries where Hitler had taken over. And earlier, when the fascists had started to take over Italy, and they insisted that the Giovinezza, which is the party hymn, be played at every public event in Tuscany. He said, no, I'm not going to do that. And you mentioned before, he was mobbed and attacked and beaten after one concert by a vicious mob because he had defied the Il Duce. He stuck to his politics. He was very democratic beliefs. He believed in human rights. He was sick about the fact that he couldn't and wouldn't play in Italy. Once after that attack, he said, I'm done. Mussolini, it was a very tender moment for him because this guy was a national treasure. So he couldn't really do anything bad, but they would intimidate him. They tapped his phones, they took his passports away for time, they threatened imprisonment or else. But Toscanini stayed living in Milan, but played around the world and said, but not in Italy. So when this opportunity came up, and it was getting very difficult for him and his family, it was not pleasant because he was getting more and more vocal as the stakes were rising. He took advantage of this opportunity and he moved his whole family. He left his beloved country behind and he moved his whole family to New York for the inauguration of this orchestra. He didn't get back to Italy till after World War II, where I think he conducted a La Scala.
May 11th, 1946.
Okay. And in 1943 and 44, the film Hymn of Nations was produced, which still just tears every time I see it, because the regime, the fascist regime had fell, Mussolini was out, and even though Toscanini wasn't going to go back to Italy, he developed this special concert based on Verdi's work, Hymn of Nations, and John Pierce and the Westminster Chorus and so forth. And it's a beautiful film, which you can get on YouTube, the half-hour version, the short version, the mid-sized version, whatever version you want. Very emotional, because it's an homage to all the Allies, as well as to the original Verdi work. And you can just see the passion in his face and to be reconnected with his country once again, even though he wasn't physically going to go back quite yet. The other thing is he went to Israel in 38, I think.
Yeah.
In support of and to honor the Jewish refugee musicians who had been lucky enough to get to Israel. And he conducted the first orchestra of these musicians, which has turned into the Israel Philharmonic. But he was very, very conscious of human rights, and that continued on throughout.
In fact, so many musicians who have gone to Israel since then have gone inspired by the model of Toscanini. And I think a famous one is Zubin Mehta, but there are many who go to Israel. John Andrea Nozeda now is one of them, because they were inspired by Toscanini's awareness that this orchestra that Toscanini created in Israel was about life, was about preserving musicians and music, and at a time when the nation of Israel didn't exist yet. For refugee, as you said, refugee Jews, mostly Jews, who performed there. And music, classical music, was part of the landscape and part of the culture, because these were people who were fleeing orchestras in Germany and Austria, in the Soviet Union to some degree, Poland certainly. Yeah. And suddenly they found themselves in the desert among the kibbutzim and so on, and creating an orchestra that's a world-class orchestra nowadays. So that too is among his achievements. The piece that I specifically wanted to talk about, because I care about it very deeply, is by Dmitri Shostakovich and is known as the Leningrad Symphony. And Shostakovich, who was from St. Petersburg, Leningrad, endured the 900-day siege of the city, in which they had no food and they had no fuel, and that is very far north in Russia, and it's very cold. And they cut down all the trees of the city, and they were living on insects. And yet the people persisted. And there was a blockade of the city, because it was the port of the Soviet Union to the west, Odessa in the south to go to the Mediterranean, but in the north, it was St. Petersburg, Leningrad. And Shostakovich wrote a symphony that expresses all the courage and the defiance of the people of that time. And Toscanini knew about this. And Toscanini in 1942 arranged for planes to fly to Norway, and then little bits of paper of the score would be transmitted out to the area of northern Norway, a town called Kirkenes, which is right where Russia meets Norway. And it would be flown to New York and through England or Scotland or Ireland sometimes. And they pieced together this symphony. Toscanini supervised the musicologist who put together this music. And he premiered it in June, or I think early July of 1942 with the NBC Symphony. This fantastic work of political and cultural defiance known as the Leningrad Symphony. I believe it's number 7 by Shostakovich. And Shostakovich and Toscanini were on the cover of Time magazine because it was a huge thumbing of the nose to the Nazis that Shostakovich could get this out. It was an awakening to the people of the world of what the people of Leningrad were enduring. Because yes, the Soviet Union was communist and not necessarily the same political outlook as Britain or America or France, but we were allies in World War II, and the Soviet people were phenomenally courageous and lost 20 million people. And whatever we want to talk about politics, the courage and defiance was phenomenal. And that piece of music inspired renewed interest in helping the people of Leningrad. And it was Shostakovich, of course, but it was Toscanini who made it happen. I don't know if you knew that story.
I didn't know that story.
Yeah.
I absolutely did not.
I know that recordings exist, probably sounding pretty scratchy, of the 1942 broadcast. I know they're in archives somewhere. But next time people listen to this Leningrad Symphony by Shostakovich, I want people to know the role that Toscanini had in it, because to me, it's one of the great stories in the history of music. And it's a fantastic piece of music that, even if we didn't know the backstory, holds up as a great piece of music. Right. But the fourth movement in particular, I'm getting goosebumps as I say this, you can just hear the people of Leningrad saying, we can chop down our trees, we can freeze to death, we can live on insects, we're not giving up. And that fourth symphony, I want everyone now, when we're done with this conversation, to go listen to it either if you have a recording, or better on IDAGIO.
They have it.
Place to, of course, is the place to hear it. So there's that. I want to talk to you a bit about, more than a bit, about the musical selections that I asked you to give to our listeners on IDAGIO, because I added every link to every Toscanini NBC Symphony Orchestra recording, but you, not surprisingly, gave us works for the violin.
Yeah.
Were the Felix Mendelssohn and were the Tchaikovsky Concerto for Orchestra particular favorites of your father's?
They were particular favorites of mine.
Okay.
And even back in childhood, could it have been because I heard the NBC Symphony playing it? Possibly, but that wasn't the direct connection. But the Italian Symphony especially was always just my favorite. And I know that they had played it. And so it must have been a connection, but it's also was then and still remains. I get such a thrill and enjoyment when I hear it. And so it's almost a coincidence, but probably not a coincidence that a lot of these are violin pieces. I didn't set out to think that way. It just naturally happened. It's what I've been listening to. And, you know, when someone says to you, what are your 5 favorite books of all time? You know, you freeze, you absolutely freeze. Or what's your favorite restaurant? I don't know. I don't. So this caught me off guard a little bit. And I had to, I just went, when you asked me to put it together, I just went with kind of a gut instinct reaction of my favorites. I didn't think too much about
That's
the
fine.
reasons. Yeah.
You also included all 9 symphonies of Beethoven. In fact, everything that Toscanini recorded with the NBC Symphony Orchestra of Beethoven. For people who really wouldn't know Toscanini, they would make the assumption that he was a conductor of Italian repertory. He certainly was, but he conducted all the German symphonic works, and that made him different too, because before that, a conductor tended to conduct from his school, so to speak, his nation, his national heritage. So French conductors did French music, and German conductors and Austrians did their music, and Russians did Russian music, and Italians did Italian music. And to this day, there's the expectation among certain audiences that Italians only do Italian music. And yet we have seen conductors such as Claudio Abbado, Carlo Maria Giulini, who was a great Brahms specialist, Riccardo Muti, Gian Andrea Nozeda, Fabio Luisi. These are just a few, Riccardo Chailly, who conduct music that's not just of the Italian tradition, magnificent though that is. But it was really Toscanini who broke the template.
I've watched on YouTube almost all of those symphonies that have to end up on YouTube. Not everything does. The video, not, you know, all the recordings are there. And so that was right in the forefront of my mind when you asked that question, because I had just been watching all of them, trying to find certain sequences. And also very pleased whenever the camera panned and I saw my father playing. But, you know, I was, for the last few years, after many, many decades and being much younger, I was steeped in the lore and the time and the feeling and the personality of the maestro. So to watch him on YouTube, for me, is very important now, because I felt so close to him as a result of working on this book and sifting through photographs. But to see him in action and to see him, that was also not just what musical piece it was, but to see him. And there are times when you say, he looks just like Hupke's photograph. Well, of course he does. You know, it's the other way around. But just how he held his hands, and when the hand went to the heart, and his eyes, and it meant so much to me. So I happened to be watching all the Beethoven symphonies just at the point when you asked me that question.
You also have Pavarotti singing Nessun dorma by Puccini, which Toscanini, well, we know that Toscanini conducted the premiere at La Scala in 1926. Puccini died in 1924, having only written Turandot up to Liu's death. And Toscanini commissioned Franco Alfano to complete the score based on Puccini's notes. A similar thing in a way to what you did with the coda to your father's book, the last. Right. And Toscanini, I think, put a permanent curse on that opera, because at the moment where Liu dies, Toscanini at La Scala that night put down his baton and said to the audience, and I believe these are the exact words, "E qui posò la mano del maestro," and here the maestro, being Puccini, put down his hand. And he didn't play the Alfano that night. So the Alfano has become like an afterthought, and people debate endlessly whether it was faithful to Puccini. We will never know. I think it mostly is, but it's louder and a bit cruder. But maybe Puccini had planned for it to be loud at the end anyway, because it's a loud opera. But Nessun dorma is a classic, but you picked Pavarotti, conducted by Zubin Mehta. Any reason Pavarotti? Any reason this aria?
When the 3 tenors came out, 30 years ago, whatever. it
July
was.
1990, July
Okay.
5th, 1990.
And we all were just struck by lightning by this event. And when they play it on the radio, there was a DVD, whatever tape. I remember having to pull over. I was living in LA. I had to pull over to the side of the road when he was doing that particular aria, because I was just sobbing. And that stuck with me. And then, of course, over the years, we've seen that video many times, and they performed elsewhere. And I went in LA to see them perform. But it was just so personal at that moment, and so from the heart. I don't know how else to explain it. I was also a very, very big fan of Plácido Domingo, but this particular moment in time was so personal that where I had to stop the car and just wait till the end. So that was,
there's the backstory of that whole story that I'll tell a bit of. I don't want to dominate this, but I was involved in that 3 tenor event because Jose Carreras had been very ill with leukemia and was treated at the Hutchinson Clinic in Seattle. And he was 40, and that would have been a high earning period for him. And he lost all of his funds, and he had to pay medical expenses, although he got help from colleagues. And Luciano thought, wouldn't it be nice to help Jose and bring him back to the stage? And Plácido agreed. And so it was developed basically as a fundraiser to help pay these events. And they donated their fees, Luciano and Plácido and Maida. But then they realized what a hit they had on their hands. So they did 46 more and raised money for all of this. What was very interesting was each of the 3 men took their $5 million fee less agent expenses for each of the 46 concerts. And Carreras built a foundation for leukemia research and the helping of children and young people with leukemia, anyone really. Domingo poured it into development of young opera singers and created a foundation for training and study of opera singers. And Pavarotti, primarily for children in war. And because Luciano, he was a friend for 29 years, I call him Luciano. He lived in Modena in World War II, not far from where Toscanini was, and knew war. And at the age of 12, he nearly died. And therefore, the whole world of war and so on was very strong for him. He saw people executed. And so he would go do concerts in Bosnia, and he would go fundraise for children who were in desperate straits elsewhere. It's now public knowledge one of his own daughters was very ill and thankfully recovered. And therefore, he devoted it to children, not just who were ill like Carreras with leukemia, but children in war and children who were in need. And I mention this because people said, oh, how greedy they all were. No, the 3 of them handed over all that money to wonderful causes that are part of their legacy.
And also to watch how generous on stage they were with each other.
Yes,
it felt very genuine.
And they brought joy to many people. I mean, I'm an opera guy, so therefore, to me, that was sort of the night off from opera. And it was fine, but it was for a different audience. And the scope was to raise money for these causes. Although they didn't talk about that. That was not their... Carreras clearly spoke about helping find cures and developing treatments for leukemia. And Domingo, with his actions, supported so many young artists around the world. And Pavarotti, as I mentioned, did his Pavarotti and Friends concerts every year. And I don't know if you've seen the Ron Howard documentary about Pavarotti.
I
was consultant on that.
That
documentary.
I think I watched it 3 times.
Yeah. I recommend it to people. So I want to conclude what's been a wonderful conversation. We're talking about This Was Toscanini by Samuel Antek and his daughter Lucy Antek Johnson, who's here, the Maestro, My Father and Me. I want to ask you about your career. What did you do? And I know you went to the High School of Music and Art in New York, but for art, not music.
Yeah.
And you played the piano as a child, but put it aside at a certain point. What did you do?
So I was fortunate enough to be exposed at a young age to kind of all the arts. Definitely the piano, which the same piano is still sitting right here.
Mm-hmm.
And then my mother, who was an artist, encouraged me to draw from a very early age. It had nothing to do with profession or results, but just enjoy the experience. And then I got very taken up by ballet. And more than just the typical young girl who goes to ballet lessons, I took it very seriously and was accepted into the Balanchine School for American Ballet. And I think it was for 2 years, had the Russian teachers and so forth. And it was thrilling. It was thrilling. And those were I think Nutcracker Suite had just been introduced. I mean, I was in New York. Oh my God. When I got to high school and I was accepted into music and art for art, to major in art, I realized I would have to put too much effort into ballet and give up my life. And I wanted to be a regular person. And then I got accepted into Boston University School of Fine Art for fine art. Along the way, I got this bug that I really wanted to be out in the real world, and that being in school, now this is a way back where having a college degree didn't have as much weight as it certainly does now, or certainly did for the last few decades. It was okay if you didn't have a college degree. And I said to my mother, who was just shocked and not very happy, I want to leave school. I want to work in television production. What? And you couldn't really go to school in those days. It was the 60s for television production. I lived in New York. I can go get a job. And I had people who knew people. And I wanted to be behind the scenes, helping to create, not necessarily to be the leader, but to help be part of the team that created something that ended up on the stage or on the screen or television. The whole thing was so romantic to me. And that's what I did. I started off at NBC. My first job was in the record library because there was still a radio presence. It was called Monitor. And I would help the producers of Monitor, who was a radio program, pick their songs and pick their records. And I would listen to every album I was having. And slowly I worked my way into more sophisticated productions as an associate producer with the bigger producers in New York at the time, including David Susskind, and Harry Belafonte was doing a lot of musical variety. And I worked with Alan King, who had a production company, and he was doing sitcoms, not just comedy specials. All of these people were producers. And I was one of the handful that everybody hired because I kind of really knew what I was doing and loved it. And then the migration to California started in the mid 70s when the work dried up. It was before cable. Yes, it was before cable. And the work in New York dried up and there was a migration to Los Angeles. And I was part of that migration. And I said, well, I've worked for 10 years in production. I want to try something new. And I got a job in the network programming department as an executive at NBC again, and which had nothing to do with my dad. And I was exposed to late night and drama and variety shows and daytime and children's programming. Then I produced a couple of movies for television on my own, and then got hired by CBS, which was really my last long gig for 14 years, senior VP of daytime and children's programming. Through all of that, and especially with daytime, which was soap operas, you're working with writers all the time and working on long-term story and scripts and thinking ahead. And it was a team effort. So I was very used to working with writers and acting as an editor, not a creator. It didn't occur to me to create. I have to take a sip of water.
Mhm.
Excuse me. In the
I
arts.
don't know. There we go. So I was going to say you
Okay.
had a sip of water and then it
When-
froze.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as exposed as I was to the other arts, I took another turn and went into show business, and loved it. Loved being part of a team and loved creating things. And so and then I took memoir writing as a interest. And I started in Los Angeles and continued it here. So not that I ever planned to be a professional writer. I didn't even know that a book would one day be in the future. But you use your own memories and learn the technique of forming a complete story, a beginning, middle, and end. And you just use your own experience as the plot. Those workshops were invaluable to this because I understood more than I would have if I was just writing freeform. So that's my background. And I now live in Connecticut.
So not every listener in the world knows who Alan King was. He was a comedian, he was a producer, he had a big cigar, unfortunately, all the time, and he died of lung cancer. My father, when I was born, he was a touring musician. I spoke before about orchestra wives. He was an unmarried musician, but when he met my mother and they married, and then I was born, he was more interested in staying close to home. And while he continued to play trombone in orchestras in New York City, he learned piano tuning. And he became a wonderful piano tuner for many of the pianists who lived around 57th Street and on the Upper West Side, but also the opera singer Licia Albanese. And he would take me along when he tuned pianos. And I usually would meet the wife of the musician, or sometimes if the musician was a woman, I would meet the spouse, or just sit and be quiet and listen and learn. And Licia Albanese, being an Italian, took me into the kitchen and fed me and taught me how to make certain recipes. And I believe her name was Jeannie, was Alan King's wife, lived in Great Neck. And Kings Point, yes, just as basically Greater Great Neck. And and she was absolutely lovely. He was not lovely necessarily.
I liked him.
I liked him. He was funny, very funny.
He was very funny. And also I worked for him every day. And he was also a big fan of the NBC Symphony and Toscanini. He was fun to be with, and he was everywhere. You know, he knew everybody. He was in every tennis tournament. But he was a nightclub guy. I mean, he came out of that world.
Yeah,
you know.
He was very funny. He would smoke a cigar, not the way George Burns smoked a cigar for timing. Alan King really smoked his cigars. He'd say, "Who's this kid?"
Right.
And his wife would say, "This is a very nice boy. He's the son of the piano tuner. We'll feed him something." And so it was interesting being in the homes of all of these famous people, mostly musicians, but also entertainers like Alan King. I liked him very much, but I remember that his wife was absolutely charming and kind and protective of anyone who got near him. Not that she was protective of him, she protected people from him.
Well, that's how it worked. I mean, she was she was lovely.
Yeah,
I remember her.
So you're lovely too. It's been a real pleasure to get to know you in our conversation.
Me too, Fred.
And I hope to meet you in life post-pandemic or when the pandemic evolves. Your book is wonderful. I wouldn't say it if I didn't mean it. I love how it telescopes. I love all the heart in the book. I love your father's beautiful writing. I love, as I said, we're friends with Harvey Sachs, who's a genius writing about Toscanini, but this is a very different view than Harvey's books, which are scholarly and authoritative. And
biography. I mean, they're,
Yeah.
biography. This is
and
not a biography.
history, but this is a very personal experience about one man's relationship to another man, and then your relationship to them.
I've described it as being invited into a master class with an artistic genius, that you're witnessing his process. And that what I've done is help to make a tribute to two musicians whose paths fortuitously crossed.
You did it very well, and I thank you.
Thank you for